Our first honoree this evening is the owner and founder of Evergreen International Aviation, which he founded in 1960 with the idea that aircraft could be used as angels of mercy, as well as industrial workhorses. He has built his company into one of the most diversified and successful aviation businesses in the world. Headquartered in McMinnville, Oregon, Evergreen employs more than 4,500 people and has 100 bases worldwide. Its subsidiaries operate a myriad of aviation divisions, one of which maintains a fleet of Boeing 747 aircraft, including Boeing's modified 747-400 Dream Lifter to support the 787 Dreamliner project. Another division maintains retrofitted 747s, which are designed to carry large quantities of water or fire retardant to fight forest fires. Inspired by his late son, Captain Michael King Smith's vision and love of aviation, Mr. Smith built the Evergreen Aviation and Space Museum, which houses such aircraft as the Howard Hughes Spruce Goose and more than 80 other historic aircraft and space exhibits. The museum, located on Captain Michael King Smith Way in McMinnville, Oregon, has had over 1 million guests since its opening. On March 2nd, 1990, when the first Gulf War had just ended, and Saddam Hussein ordered over 700 oil wells to be set on fire in Kuwait, he and Red Adair were on the first flight to Kuwait to help put out those fires. For his efforts during Desert Storm and Desert Shield, the National Defense Transportation Association named him Man of the Year. He has been the recipient of many, many other awards from organizations around the world. He's a graduate of the University of Washington and has a Doctor of Aeronautical Science degree and a Doctor of Business Administration degree as well. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Delford M. Smith. The dream of our next recipient was to become a pilot, perhaps to become a famous military aviator. But his claim to fame came not from flying, but from falling, almost 20 miles straight down. He entered the Air Force as an aviation cadet and was commissioned a second lieutenant in March of 1950. From 1950 to 1953, he served as a jet pilot in the 86th Fighter Bomber Squadron in Germany and then was assigned to the Air Force Missile Development Center at Holloman Air Force Base, New Mexico. In June of 1957, he made a balloon flight to 96,000 feet in the first flight of the Air Force's Project Man High. After being assigned to the Aerospace Medical Research Laboratories, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, he was appointed test director of Project Excelsior, investigating escape from high-altitude flight. On August 16, 1960, from 102,800 feet, the highest altitude from which man has ever jumped, our recipient did the jumping. In free fall for 4.5 minutes, he experienced temperatures as low as negative 94 degrees Fahrenheit. He opened his parachute at 18,000 feet and landed safely in the New Mexico desert after a 13-minute, 45-second descent. He also volunteered for 3 combat tours in Vietnam and served as the commander of the famous 555th Triple Nickel Tactical Fighter Squadron flying F-4s. After shooting down a MiG-21 in aerial combat, he himself was shot down on May 11, 1972, and spent 11 months as a prisoner of war. He subsequently continued his career and retired as a colonel in 1978. He's received numerous awards for solo transatlantic balloon flights and is the author of several articles about his 1960 leap, including The Long Lonely Leap and his newly published autobiography, Come Up and Get Me. He's also the subject of the Naval Institute book, The Pre-Astronauts. And now meet our next recipient, ladies and gentlemen, Colonel Joe Kittinger Jr. Our next honoree tonight is retired from the Air National Guard, the U.S. Air Force, and the NASA astronaut program. He is currently an engineering consultant and technical advisor on space vehicles and operations, and serves as a technical advisor to NASA's International Space Station Advisory Committee. He graduated from the University of Kansas with a degree in aeronautical engineering and entered the U.S. Air Force Flying School in 1956. He served with the 474th Fighter Day Squadron flying F-100s. In 1960, he was selected for the U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School and the Aerospace Research Pilot School at Edwards Air Force Base, commanded by then Colonel Chuck Yeager. He then began flying the X-15 rocket aircraft. On June 29, 1965, he flew the X-15 to an altitude of 280,600 feet and became the youngest pilot ever to qualify as an astronaut. 3 of his 16 flights in the X-15 exceeded the 50-mile altitude to qualify. Also in 1960, he was selected as one of 19 pilots for NASA's space missions. He was backup for lunar module pilot on Apollo 14 and was scheduled to fly to and walk on the moon with Apollo 17 until budget cuts canceled the last 3 planned Apollo flights. On November 12, 1981, he commanded the second orbital test flight of the Shuttle Columbia. He became the one and only pilot to manually fly an aerospace vehicle from Mach 25 to landing. He was the commander of Space Shuttle Discovery in August of 1985. He has flown over 185 different types of aircraft, including 38 different fighter and attack aircraft, logging over 14,000 flight hours, nearly 10,000 in jets, and nearly 225 in space. He has received numerous awards and service medals, including the Air Force Distinguished Flying Cross with oak leaf clusters. In his last active duty military assignment, he was the Air National Guard Assistant to the Command-in-Chief, U.S. Space Command, and North American Air Defense Command. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a Kansan of the Year, a former Air Force officer, an astronaut, a test pilot emeritus of the U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School, Major General Joe H. Engel. Our final recipient of the evening graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and joined the Air Force, where he flew F-86 Sabre jets in 66 combat missions in Korea, shot down 2 MiG-15s, and was decorated with the Distinguished Flying Cross. He earned his Doctorate of Science in Astronautics at MIT and wrote his thesis on manned orbital rendezvous. Selected by NASA in 1963 into the 3rd group of astronauts, he was the first with a doctorate and became known as Dr. Rendezvous. The docking and rendezvous techniques he devised for spacecraft in Earth and lunar orbit became critical to the success of the Gemini and Apollo programs and are still used today. On July 20th, 1969, he became the second human being to set foot on the lunar surface following mission commander Neil Armstrong. They spent 21 hours on the lunar surface and returned with 46 pounds of moon rocks, but returned safely. The largest worldwide television audience, an estimated 600 million people, witnessed this unprecedented heroic event. Upon returning from the moon, the Apollo 11 crew was decorated with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest American peacetime award. After retiring from NASA, he was assigned as Commandant of the U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School at Edwards Air Force Base. He retired from active duty in the Air Force in 1972, but has consistently remained at the forefront of efforts to ensure America's continued leadership in human space exploration. He devised a master plan for missions to Mars, a spacecraft transportation system with perpetual cycling orbits between Earth and Mars. He's received 3 U.S. patents for his rocket systems and schematics. He reaches out to today's youth with his illustrated children's books, Reaching for the Moon and Look to the Stars, both New York Times bestsellers. His 2009 New York Times best-selling autobiography, Magnificent Desolation, has inspired the lives of readers worldwide. In addition, he has co-authored 2 space science fiction novels, Encounter with Tiber and The Return. His nonfiction works include the best-selling historical documentary Men from Earth and an early 1970s autobiography, Return to Earth. His recent trip with President Barack Obama aboard Air Force One to the space conference at Kennedy Space Center was testament to how influential his opinions are to the lead decision-makers in Washington. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to present to you an American hero, Dr. Rendezvous, Buzz Aldrin.